This is SOSF. Okay, let's fire this thing up. We're gonna get into some seriously strange territory today, stuff that sounds like fiction but might be more real than you think. We all know about the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? October 1962. It's the story they teach you in high school. Kennedy, Khrushchev, a tense standoff, spy planes, boats in the ocean. And then everyone just kind of shook hands and walked away, and the world kept spinning. It's presented as this moment of high-stakes political chess where the brilliant minds won, and humanity was saved. We got a pat on the back and a sigh of relief. But what if I told you that's not the real story? What if I told you the real story is so much darker, so much crazier, and that we weren't saved by brilliant men playing chess? We were saved by dumb luck. We were like a toddler who wandered onto a freeway during rush hour, played in the middle of the road for 13 days, and then wandered off without a scratch, totally clueless about the hundreds of ways they were about to get smeared across the pavement. Because what was waiting on the other side of that handshake wasn't just a war. It wasn't just, a couple of mushroom clouds. We're talking about a full-scale, pre-programmed, automated apocalypse. A literal doomsday machine that was already built, already turned on, and just waiting for someone to nudge the joystick in the wrong direction. And the men in charge? Some of them didn't even fully understand the monster they had built. I got my hands on this deep dive analysis, a multidisciplinary look at what would have actually happened if things went south during those 13 days. And it's not science fiction, man. This is based on the actual war plans, the actual science, the declassified documents. It's the world that almost was. And it's absolutely terrifying. Forget zombies. Forget alien invasions. The scariest monster story is the one we wrote for ourselves. So let's just get into it. Let's look at what the world looked like in 1962. First off, you gotta understand, this wasn't a fair fight. We talk about the Cold War as this standoff between two equal superpowers, staring each other down. That's the Hollywood version. The reality in 1962 was a completely different beast. In terms of nuclear muscle, the United States was the heavyweight champion of the world, and the Soviet Union was, like, a scrappy middle schooler who'd been lifting weights for a few months. The numbers are just staggering. In October of '62, the US had something like 27,000 nuclear weapons in its arsenal. 27,000. The Soviets? They had around 3,000. That's a 10-to-1 advantage. It's not a balance scale. It's a seesaw with an elephant on one side and a cat on the other. And it gets even more lopsided when you talk about how you'd actually deliver those bombs. When it came to the really fast stuff, the intercontinental ballistic missiles, the ICBMs that can cross the globe in 30 minutes, we had about 177 of them ready to go. Our intelligence at the time thought the Soviets had maybe 75. But here's the crazy part. After the Cold War, when the Russians opened up their books, it turns out they probably only had between 20 and 44 that were actually operational. 20. Can you imagine that? We had this near-perfect ability to just wipe their entire long-range arsenal off the map before they could even get their missiles out of the ground. Their main strength was in bombers, which are slow, and some early submarines that were so janky they had to surface to launch their missiles, making them giant sitting ducks. So, you're the Soviets. You know you're hopelessly outgunned. You know the other guy can sucker punch you and knock you out before you can even raise your fists. What do? You develop this terrifying use it or lose it mentality. Soviet military doctrine at the time was basically, if you even think the Americans are about to attack, you launch everything you have, immediately. No questions asked. Because if you wait to see if they're serious, you'll have nothing left to retaliate with. This created the ultimate hair-trigger scenario. It's a Mexican standoff where one guy is twitching like he's had way too much caffeine because he knows he's dead if he doesn't shoot first. That's why they put missiles in Cuba in the first place. It was a desperate, Hail Mary pass to try and even the odds just a tiny little bit. Now let's look at the American side. If the Soviet plan was born out of desperation, ours was born out of something almost scarier. Cold, brutal, and terrifyingly rigid logic. We had a thing called SIOP-62. It stands for the Single Integrated Operational Plan. Sounds boring, right? Like some accounting spreadsheet. Wrong. This was America's first ever unified plan for nuclear war. It was the playbook for Armageddon. And here's the part that'll make the hair on your arm stand up. It had almost zero flexibility. It wasn't a menu of options for the president. It was a single, massive, all-out punch. When the top military brass briefed the plan to President Kennedy in 1961, he was apparently so disgusted he just walked out of the meeting. He later said to his Secretary of State, "And we call ourselves the human race." SIOP-62 was built around one main idea, a gigantic, preemptive strike against the entire Sino-Soviet bloc that means Russia, China, and all their allies in Eastern Europe. The main option called for launching over 3,200 nuclear weapons at more than 1,000 targets. The goal wasn't just to win a war. The plan's own document stated the goal was to destroy the Soviet Union and China as viable societies, to remove them from the category of a major industrial power. This wasn't warfare. This was erasure. They had this doctrine of overkill that was so insane it even freaked out the generals. The plan required a 90% probability of destroying every single target. To do that, they assigned multiple bombs to the same place. Get this. A Soviet city the size of Nagasaki, which, remember, was leveled by a single 22-kiloton bomb in 1945, would be hit by 3 separate 80-kiloton weapons under this plan. It's like using a sledgehammer to kill a fly, and then dropping 2 more sledgehammers on it just to be sure. President Eisenhower himself, the guy who was the supreme commander of Allied forces in World War II, said the plan frightened the devil out of me. So that's the setup. You have one side that's terrified and ready to shoot at the first sign of trouble. And you have the other side with a giant, unstoppable, pre-programmed death machine that only has one setting: obliterate everything. This isn't a chess game. It's a room filled with gasoline, with 2 guys flicking lighters at each other. So, let's play it out. How does it start? Diplomacy fails. The generals get what they want. The US launches an airstrike and invades Cuba, probably on October 29th, which is what they were pushing for. But here's the kicker. The one detail that Washington didn't know. The Soviets didn't just have long-range missiles in Cuba. They had over 90 tactical, short-range nuclear warheads, little battlefield nukes, and the local Soviet commanders on the ground had the authority to use them to defend the island against an invasion. So, American troops hit the beaches of Cuba, and suddenly, they're hit with tactical nukes. The nuclear threshold is crossed. Instantly, U.S. forces are under nuclear attack. All bets are off. The pressure on Kennedy to respond would have been unimaginable. And what's the response? It's SIOP-62. The doomsday machine kicks into gear. The order goes out. Strategic Air Command bombers, already in the air, turn towards their targets. ICBMs roar out of their silos in places like Montana and the Dakotas. Polaris submarines lurking deep in the ocean fire their missiles. In a single coordinated move, more than 3,200 nuclear weapons are heading towards the Soviet Union, China, and Eastern Europe. The total explosive power is something like 70,000 times the bomb that hit Hiroshima. 70,000. The Soviets would have had minutes of warning. Maybe enough time to launch a few dozen of their own missiles in a chaotic, desperate last gasp before their command centers, their airfields, their missile silos were just gone. Vaporized. And the human cost? The numbers from the plan itself are just. They're not real. One analysis predicted that a full strike would kill 71% of the entire urban population of the Soviet Union. Another study calculated it would be 285 million dead in Russia and China, just from the immediate effects. In the first few hours, it's hard to even wrap your head around what that looks like. In every one of the 130-plus cities on the target list, the sequence is the same. First, there's a flash of light brighter than 1,000 suns, so intense it ignites anything flammable for miles. Wood, plastic, clothes, people. Massive firestorms erupt, sucking in air and creating hurricane-force winds of pure flame. Entire cities become furnaces. Then comes the blast wave, moving faster than the speed of sound, leveling buildings like they're made of cardboard. And finally, for anyone who somehow survived the fire and the blast, there's an invisible pulse of radiation that shreds your cells from the inside out. A World Health Organization study from later in the Cold War, looking at a similar scenario, estimated that 1.1 billion people would be killed outright, and another 1.1 billion would be seriously injured with absolutely no medical help available. Because, of course, all the hospitals would be destroyed, and all the doctors would be dead. The military objective of SIOP-62, to destroy the enemy as a viable society, would have been a stunning success. But that success would be the direct trigger for something infinitely worse. Because the plan's focus on burning down every major city was the very thing that guaranteed the next stage of the apocalypse. The part that kills almost everyone else. This is where the story goes from being a war story to a story about planetary science. The immediate horror of the bombs, as insane as it is just the opening act. The real long-term planet-killing mechanism is something called nuclear winter. The idea was really fleshed out in the early 80s by a team of scientists that included the legendary Carl Sagan. You know, the Cosmos guy. These guys weren't military strategists. They were atmospheric physicists and planetary scientists. And they started asking a simple question. What happens when you set 1,000 cities on fire at the same time? What happens is you create the biggest environmental disaster in the history of the Earth. All that burning stuff, the wood from the houses, the asphalt from the roads, the plastic from the factories, the fuel from the depots, it creates a colossal amount of black, sooty smoke. These aren't like campfire smoke particles. They're super fine, and they are shot upwards with such force from the firestorms that they get injected high up into the stratosphere. Now, the stratosphere is the layer of the atmosphere above all the weather. There's no rain up there to wash this stuff out. So this black soot just stays there for years. And it spreads, carried by the high-altitude winds, until it forms a thin, dark shroud that covers the entire planet, but mostly the northern hemisphere. What does this soot shroud do? It's black, so it's incredibly good at absorbing sunlight. Instead of the sun's energy coming down and warming the ground, it gets absorbed 30,000 feet up in the air. The effect on the surface would be immediate and catastrophic. First, darkness. The amount of sunlight reaching the ground would be cut to just a few % of normal. We're not talking about a cloudy day. We're talking about a permanent, deep twilight, darker than the heaviest storm clouds you've ever seen. This darkness would persist for months, and it would be too dark for photosynthesis to happen. Photosynthesis. You know, the little thing that is the foundation of basically all life on Earth. It just stops. Second, cold. With the sun's warmth blocked, surface temperatures would plummet. The Sagan study projected that in the middle of continents like North America and Eurasia, temperatures would drop to around 25 degrees Celsius below zero. That's 13 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. And it would stay below freezing for the better part of a year, even if the war happened in the middle of summer. More modern climate models, using supercomputers, have confirmed this. They predict summer temperature drops of 36 degrees Fahrenheit across the main farming regions of the US, Europe, and Asia. It's a man-made ice age, and it happens in a matter of weeks. Third, drought. The whole global weather system gets thrown into chaos. Rainfall over the continents would decrease by something like 75%. So the world beneath the soot clouds would be dark, frozen, and bone dry. But the planet had one more twisted surprise for us. This one is a real slow burn horror. So you've got this layer of soot in the stratosphere, right? And it's absorbing all this sunlight, so the stratosphere itself gets incredibly hot, like 100 degrees Celsius hotter than normal. This massive heating triggers a series of chemical reactions that just annihilate the Earth's protective ozone layer. So you get this 1-2 punch from hell. For the first few years after the war, the planet is in the cold and dark phase. Then, as the soot finally starts to settle out of the stratosphere, the sun starts to reappear. But it's not the friendly sun we know. With the ozone layer gone, the Earth's surface is now bathed in insane levels of ultraviolet radiation. Scientists call this the ultraviolet spring. The UV index, which we see on the weather report, is considered extreme when it hits 11. In this post-nuclear winter world, it could reach values of over 35 for years. Any human survivors who crawl out of their bunkers would get severe sunburns in minutes. Cataracts and skin cancer would be rampant. And it's not just us. This level of UV radiation is lethal to most plants and to the phytoplankton in the ocean. So the planet's strategy for dealing with the survivors is this. First, it freezes and starves them in the dark for a few years, and then it scorches anything that's left with deadly radiation. It's a complete, systematic, ecological demolition. So what does this mean for the billions of people who survived the initial blasts? Well, their cause of death just shifts from fire and radiation to starvation. It's a silent, grinding famine on a scale that is impossible to comprehend. Think about it. Modern agriculture is a delicate thing. Our staple crops, wheat, corn, rice, they need specific temperatures and a certain amount of sunlight. A drop of just a couple of degrees in the average growing season temperature can cause crop failures. A drop of 20 or 30 degrees? It's not even a question. It means the complete and total failure of every crop, everywhere, for years. Some recent studies using these advanced climate and agricultural models are just mind-blowing. They project that a large-scale nuclear war would cause a 90% drop in global calorie production within a few years. 90%. The conclusion of these models is that over 5 billion people would die from starvation. Let that sink in. 5 billion people. The bombs and the radiation are a footnote. The real killer is the silent famine. And you can't just turn to the oceans for food. The initial darkness kills the phytoplankton, which is the base of the entire marine food web. The whole system collapses. The fish die. There's no escape. At any given time, the entire world has only a few months of food reserves stored away. In a post-war world with no way to grow more food, no infrastructure, no transportation, those reserves would be gone in a flash. The single overriding reality for almost every human left alive would be a desperate, day-to-day struggle for food that would ultimately be hopeless. And what about the survivors of the famine? For them, the world itself remains a poison. The fallout from thousands of ground-burst explosions would contaminate huge areas of the planet. The soil, the water, any food source you could find would be radioactive. Anyone living downwind from a target would get high doses, leading to acute radiation syndrome, radiation sickness. It's a truly horrific way to die, as your own body just falls apart from the inside. For those who get lower doses, the damage is more subtle. The radiation breaks your DNA. Your cells try to repair it, but sometimes they make mistakes. And those mistakes, years or decades down the line, turn into cancer. We know this from the long-term studies of the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There was a clear, dose-dependent spike in leukemia that peaked a few years after the bombings, and then a steady, elevated rate of all kinds of solid cancers, lung, breast, colon, that continues for the rest of their lives. Now here's one of the weirdest and most fascinating parts of this whole grim story. One of the biggest fears of the atomic age was genetic damage. The idea that survivors would pass on mutated genes to their children, creating generations of people with birth defects and horrible diseases. It's the classic post-apocalyptic trope of the mutant. But here's the thing. Based on the best real-world data we have, it's probably not true. For over 70 years, scientists have been studying the children of the atomic bomb survivors in Japan. Tens of thousands of them. They've looked at everything: birth defects, cancer rates, childhood mortality, chromosomal abnormalities. And in all of that data, they have found no statistically significant increase in any of these problems among the children of survivors compared to the general population. Now, this doesn't mean radiation isn't a mutagen. It is. But it suggests that for the doses the survivors received, the effect at the population level is just too small to be detected against the natural background rate of mutations. So while the survivors themselves would suffer horribly, the idea of a world full of radiation-spawned mutants is likely just fiction. The suffering of the next generation wouldn't be from their genes, it would be from being born into a broken, empty world. And that brings us to the final stage, the collapse of civilization itself. The physical, climatic, and biological catastrophes all culminate in this: the complete and utter unraveling of everything we call society. Modern civilization is an incredibly complex and interconnected machine. It depends on energy, trade, communication, trust, and specialization. You don't know how to grow all your own food, or refine gasoline, or practice medicine, or build a microchip. But you can do your one specific job, and you trust that millions of other people are doing their jobs, and the system holds together. A nuclear war doesn't just damage this machine, it vaporizes its foundations. The destruction of cities erases the centers of government, of industry, of knowledge. The nuclear winter destroys the agricultural base that allows billions of people to live in those cities in the first place. The nation-state, the global economy, they would just cease to exist. So what comes next? What do the scattered bands of survivors do? They would be forced to reorganize themselves into much simpler, much more local, and almost certainly much more brutal ways of life. The most likely outcome in the power vacuum is the rise of warlords. In a world with no laws and no police, power belongs to whoever has the guns and the will to use them. Groups of armed people would seize control of the last valuable resources: a warehouse of canned food, a source of clean water, an old armory. They would offer protection to others in exchange for total loyalty and a cut of whatever they could scavenge. It's basically a primitive, violent form of feudalism. On a smaller scale, you'd see a kind of neo-tribalism. People would band together in small, intensely loyal groups, maybe based on family, or just the people who happen to survive in the same small town. The defining characteristic would be an absolute distrust of outsiders. In a world of total scarcity, every other person is a potential threat, a competitor for the last can of beans. Conflict becomes the default setting. Now, there is a little bit of a hopeful counter-narrative. Studies of modern disasters, hurricanes, earthquakes, floods, show that in the immediate aftermath, people are often incredibly altruistic. Social barriers dissolve, and everyone works together to rescue the injured and share what they have. They form what sociologists call a therapeutic community. And you'd probably see that in the first days and weeks after a nuclear war, pockets of humanity would exhibit this incredible cooperative spirit. But here's the crucial difference. A hurricane ends. An earthquake stops. People in a normal disaster are sustained by the hope that help is on the way, that things will eventually get back to normal. In the post-nuclear world, there is no outside help coming. There is no return to normal. The crisis isn't temporary, it's the new, permanent state of being. And under the relentless, years-long pressure of cold, darkness, and starvation, those initial bonds of altruism would inevitably wear thin and then snap. The logic would shift from short-term communal survival to long-term individual or small group survival. And in that environment, the groups that are better organized for violence and coercion, the warlords, would always have the advantage. So when you piece it all together, the story of what almost happened in 1962 is a chilling, cascading chain of collapse. A flawed, rigid military plan was designed to trigger a massive nuclear exchange. That exchange was guaranteed to cause an environmental catastrophe in the form of nuclear winter. That environmental collapse was guaranteed to cause a biological collapse, killing billions through famine. And that biological collapse was guaranteed to cause a societal collapse, throwing the last remnants of humanity back into a new dark age, played out on a poisoned and dying planet. We didn't just dodge a bullet in the Cuban Missile Crisis. We stood at the absolute edge of a cliff, looking down into a chasm that would have swallowed human history whole, and for reasons we still don't fully understand, we stumbled backward instead of forward. The world we live in today, with all its problems and all its wonders, is the world that never should have been, the one that survived by the thinnest of margins. It makes you wonder what kind of world we're building now, and what kind of cliffs we're walking along without even knowing it. So here's the question I'll leave you with, a real brain melter to chew on. Imagine you are one of the last survivors. The cold and the dark are finally starting to lift after years, but the world is a brutal landscape of warlords and desperate tribes. You and your small cooperative group have managed to secure a hidden library, one of the last repositories of human knowledge, containing books on agriculture, engineering, medicine, philosophy, and history. The warlord who controls your region discovers your library. He doesn't want to destroy it. He wants to use it. But he wants to use it to build a more efficient, more technologically advanced, more powerful version of his brutal dictatorship. He offers you a deal. Help him rebuild a sliver of the old world's technology in exchange for the safety and security of your people. If you refuse, he will eventually find a way to take the knowledge by force and likely destroy your community in the process. What do? Do you share the knowledge, knowing it will be used to create a more sophisticated tyranny, in the hopes that some good might eventually come from it generations down the line? Or do you refuse, or even destroy the knowledge, to prevent it from being misused, effectively condemning humanity to a much longer and more primitive dark age? What's the right call when you're trying to reboot civilization? See you next time.